She was mocked for bringing bread and water to lunch, until a millionaire CEO walked into the kindergarten cafeteria and sat beside her. The kindergarten cafeteria buzzed with the everyday chaos of lunchtime, a constant mix of clattering trays, the metallic ring of forks against plates, and the high-pitched chatter of children competing to be heard. The air smelled faintly of tomato soup and baked bread, but in one corner of the room, away from the main clusters of tables, a little girl sat quietly by herself. 5-year-old Emma Harper had chosen the far end of a small table, her shoulders drawn in slightly, as though she were trying to take up less space. In front of her was a plastic container with a single piece of plain bread and a small bottle of water, the kind sold in bulk at the corner store. She peeled at the crust with her fingers, not because she didn't like it, but because the act gave her something to do that didn't require looking up. Across the room, at a table packed with children, a few eyes kept darting in her direction. They were whispering at first, their faces twisted into sly grins, but soon the snickering grew louder. One boy called out something about poor lunches for poor kids, and another giggled loudly enough for the words to carry. Emma's cheeks flushed, but she didn't lift her head. Instead, she took a sip of her water and stared at the table as if she could disappear into it. She had learned that reacting only made things worse. Her mother, Susan, worked 2 jobs to cover the rent on their tiny apartment and pay the kindergarten fees. Mornings were always rushed, and most days there was no time, or money, for anything beyond the basics. On the days when they had fresh fruit or cheese, Emma felt like she was carrying treasure in her lunchbox, but today had been a bread and water day, and she knew exactly how it looked to everyone else. She thought about the other children's trays piled with pasta, fruit cups, and cartons of milk, and wished for just a little more color in her own meal. The cafeteria supervisor passed by once, giving her a kind smile, but didn't stop. Emma was used to this. She would finish her bread quietly, drink her water, and wait for the noise to fade as lunchtime ended. The teasing hurt, but she had learned to swallow it along with the dry bites of her meal. What she didn't know, what no one in that noisy, crowded room could have guessed, was that this ordinary lunchtime was about to take a turn so unexpected that it would change the course of her life. That morning had begun like any other for Jonathan Reeves, though his schedule included one obligation he couldn't delegate, a trustee visit to a kindergarten the company's charitable foundation had supported for years. He had attended events like this before, the kind where speeches were made, polite tours were given, and photographs were taken for press releases, but it was rare for him to spend more than an hour in such a place. Even as his sleek black sedan turned onto the quiet street, he was already planning which calls he could take on the way back to the office. Jonathan was the kind of man people noticed instantly, tall, broad-shouldered, with the calm authority of someone used to running meetings that decided the fate of millions. His dark hair was neatly combed, his light blue suit pressed to perfection, a crisp white shirt beneath it, and a silver watch that caught the light every time he moved. The kindergarten itself was cheerful but modest. The director greeted him warmly at the entrance, clearly proud to show him the improvements made with the foundation's support, freshly painted classrooms, new play equipment in the yard, and a small library corner with colorful beanbags. Jonathan listened politely, nodding at the right moments, but his mind drifted as he followed her from one room to the next. He had done his share of philanthropic visits, and they all tended to follow the same predictable pattern, until they reached the cafeteria. He had expected the usual scene, children laughing, chatting, trading snacks, but what caught his eye was the stillness of a single figure in the far corner. A small girl, no more than 5 or 6, sat alone at the edge of a tiny table, her blonde hair parted neatly into 2 braids that framed a face far too serious for her age. She wore a simple yellow dress, slightly faded from washing, and a denim jacket that looked a size too big. In front of her was a plastic container holding nothing but a piece of bread and a small bottle of water. Jonathan slowed his pace without meaning to, his attention drawn entirely to her, and he noticed the way her small fingers were breaking off pieces of the bread slowly, as if trying to make it last longer. Around her, the rest of the cafeteria was alive with noise, but a few children at a nearby table seemed to have singled her out. They whispered to one another, casting glances in her direction, then laughing in short bursts that made her shoulders tighten. Jonathan didn't need to hear the words to understand the tone. The director was still talking beside him, pointing out the bright murals painted on the walls, but her voice faded into the background. Something in the scene before him stirred a memory he hadn't thought about in years, the image of himself as a boy, sitting at a cafeteria table with a lunch that didn't match anyone else's, feeling the same kind of invisible weight pressing down. He realized he had stopped walking, and the director turned to him with a polite question he didn't hear. His focus was locked on the girl in the corner, and in that instant, the rest of the tour seemed irrelevant. Without excusing himself, he moved toward her, each step feeling oddly deliberate, as though he were crossing more than just the cafeteria floor. He had no plan, no carefully crafted line prepared for this kind of moment. All he knew was that something in him refused to walk past and pretend he hadn't seen her. Whatever business had brought him here today, it no longer mattered nearly as much as the quiet, solitary figure with the bread and water. Jonathan reached the end of the cafeteria and paused for a moment, feeling the curious glances of teachers and children on him, though he barely registered them. His eyes remained fixed on the little girl in the yellow dress. She hadn't noticed him yet, her attention was on the small crumbs she was picking from her bread, her movements slow and deliberate, as if eating too quickly might make the moment end before she was ready. He could see the faint tension in her shoulders, the way she hunched slightly over the table as though bracing herself against the noise and stares that surrounded her. The room was full of laughter and conversation, but the air around her seemed still, almost separate from everything else. Without saying a word to the director, Jonathan crossed the last few steps to the serving line. The cafeteria worker blinked in surprise when he, dressed in a tailored suit, picked up a plastic tray like every other child in the room. He scanned the options quickly, choosing a balanced lunch, pasta, fruit, a carton of milk, not because he was hungry, but because it would let him sit at the same table without drawing attention to her meager meal. Tray in hand, he turned toward the far corner, aware that the room had grown quieter. It wasn't silence exactly, but the pitch of the chatter had changed, as though the children were trying to make sense of why a man like him was walking toward the girl they so often ignored or teased. When he reached the table, he set his tray down gently beside hers. She looked up in surprise, her large blue eyes widening slightly as if she couldn't quite believe he was standing there. Up close, he noticed the faint paleness in her cheeks, the kind that comes from skipped meals, and the careful neatness of her braids, which told him someone had taken the time to make sure she looked cared for, even if other parts of her life were harder. He crouched down so his gaze met hers directly, and his voice softened in a way it rarely did in boardrooms. "Hi. Mind if I sit here?" For a moment she just blinked at him, glancing quickly toward the table of children who had been whispering earlier, as if expecting them to laugh. When they didn't, at least not immediately, she gave a small, uncertain nod. Jonathan slid onto the bench, placing his tray so it didn't crowd her space. He picked up his fork and began eating casually, as though this were the most natural arrangement in the world. The children who had been mocking her were now watching openly, their earlier smirks replaced with confusion. A few exchanged looks, as if trying to understand why the man in the immaculate suit would choose this table over any other. The teachers seemed equally puzzled, though no one interrupted. He didn't start with questions. Instead, he began to talk about something unrelated, a story from his own childhood about the day he had accidentally brought the wrong lunch to school. He described how he had been in a rush that morning and grabbed a can from the pantry without looking closely, only to discover at lunchtime that it was dog food. He told it with a light tone, exaggerating his younger self's horror at the discovery, and was rewarded with a small giggle from her. It was quick, almost shy, but it was there, and Jonathan felt a surprising sense of relief at the sound. He offered her a grape from his fruit cup, sliding it across the table. She hesitated, looking at him as if unsure whether it was really meant for her, and when he nodded, she took it between her small fingers and popped it into her mouth. That simple act seemed to shift something in the air. The tension in her shoulders eased slightly, and she began to glance at him more directly, though still with a kind of cautious curiosity. Around them, the noise of the cafeteria slowly returned, though it was different now, less sharp, less charged with the cruel energy it had carried earlier. The children at the other table seemed to have lost their taste for teasing, perhaps because they didn't know how to compete with the quiet authority of a man like Jonathan choosing her company over theirs. He could see them turning away, their attention drifting elsewhere, and he knew without having to say anything that this small decision, to sit here, to eat with her, had changed the dynamic for the rest of the day, maybe longer. For Emma, the lunch would still end, the afternoon would still come, but this moment had left a mark. Someone had noticed her. Not just noticed, but chosen her over everyone else in the room. Jonathan didn't yet understand why he'd felt compelled to act, but as he picked up another forkful of pasta, he knew with absolute certainty that walking past her had never been an option. As the noise in the cafeteria swelled back to its usual hum, Jonathan found himself studying the girl more closely. She had a way of holding herself that was both guarded and polite, as if she had learned that the safest way to get through the day was to take up as little space as possible. He didn't want to overwhelm her with direct questions, so he steered the conversation toward light, safe topics, animals, favorite colors, the kind of games she liked to play. She answered in short sentences at first, her voice soft, almost testing the air to see if it was safe to speak. But as the minutes passed, something in her began to loosen. She told him about how she liked to draw flowers in the margins of her notebooks, about the swing in the playground that went higher than the others, and about a book her teacher had read last week that she wished she could take home. Jonathan listened intently, nodding and smiling in the right places, but more than her words, he noticed the subtle shifts in her expression. When she spoke about the swing, her eyes lit up; when she mentioned the book, her fingers curled around the edge of her bread as though holding on to a small wish. He recognized in her a quiet resilience that was far beyond her years, and it made him think of moments in his own childhood when small kindnesses from unexpected places had meant the world. Halfway through their conversation, he took the risk of asking about her lunch. He didn't want to embarrass her, so he spoke lightly, almost as if he were asking why she liked a certain color. "Is bread your favorite?" he said with a hint of a smile. She gave a little shrug and said her mom made her lunch every day, but sometimes there wasn't much to pack. She said it without complaint, as though it were a fact like the weather or the time of day. Something about the casual way she accepted it made his chest tighten. He told her another story then, this one about a time when he had traded half his lunch for a friend's cookie, only to realize later that the friend had given him the last thing he had to eat that day. He wanted her to hear that kindness mattered, even in small exchanges. She listened, tilting her head slightly, as though weighing the meaning of the story. When he slid his carton of milk toward her, she hesitated again but accepted it with a soft "thank you." Jonathan noticed that the group of children who had been whispering earlier were now watching from a distance, their expressions mixed with curiosity and something that looked like unease. They seemed unsure how to process the fact that an adult, and not just any adult but someone clearly important, had chosen to sit with her. The power dynamic had shifted in ways they didn't fully understand. As the lunch period began to wind down, a teacher announced that it was time to clean up. Emma carefully closed her container, leaving the last piece of bread untouched, and Jonathan realized she was saving it for later. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes about how she lived, stretching what she had, making things last. He stood as she slid off the bench, and for a brief moment, she looked up at him in a way that caught him off guard. It wasn't quite trust yet, but it was something close, a flicker of recognition that maybe, just maybe, he was someone who saw her. He gave her a small nod, one he hoped carried the weight of a promise he didn't yet know how to put into words. When she walked away toward her classmates, he didn't immediately follow the director to the next part of the tour. Instead, he stayed a moment longer, watching her braid-swaying figure disappear into the hallway. He had come here today expecting to fulfill a routine obligation. Instead, he found himself carrying the image of a little girl with blue eyes and a lunch of bread and water, and the unsettling certainty that this would not be the last time he saw her. Jonathan caught up with the director in the hallway, but his mind was still in the cafeteria. He had intended to leave quietly after his visit, returning to the steady rhythm of conference calls and contracts, yet something in him resisted walking away. As they passed a small office, he stopped and asked the director if there was time for a brief conversation about the girl in the yellow dress. The director hesitated, her expression tightening, and for a moment Jonathan thought she might refuse. But after a quick glance toward a closed door at the end of the hall, she gestured for him to follow her inside. The office was modest, with a desk piled high with folders and a bulletin board crowded with notices. She motioned for him to sit, then lowered herself into the chair opposite. Her voice softened when she spoke, as if she were choosing her words carefully. The girl's name was Emma Harper. Her mother, Susan, was raising her alone. They lived in a small one-bedroom apartment on the edge of town, and Susan worked nights cleaning offices, along with a few daytime shifts at a grocery store. Money was tight, and some months it was a struggle just to cover rent and utilities. The bread and water lunch wasn't a rare occurrence, it was the reality on days when Susan had to stretch their groceries as far as they would go. Jonathan listened without interrupting, his fingers pressed together beneath his chin. The description painted a picture he recognized all too well. His own mother had been in a similar position once, working 2 jobs after his father left, and he remembered the way she had guarded her pride fiercely, refusing to ask for help unless there was no other choice. He asked the director whether the kindergarten offered assistance for families in need. She explained that there were programs, but funding was limited, and often the help didn't reach every child who needed it. Jonathan's jaw tightened as he thought about the ease with which his company moved millions for projects that mattered far less than this. The director added that Emma was a bright, well-behaved child, but she kept to herself. Some of the other children teased her, sensing the differences they didn't fully understand. Teachers intervened when they could, but they couldn't erase the sting of being singled out. Jonathan could imagine it vividly, the quiet ache of feeling separate from everyone else, the way it lingered long after the day ended. When the meeting concluded, Jonathan stood but didn't immediately leave. He asked the director one more question: was there a way to help without making it obvious that the help came from him? He didn't want Emma or her mother to feel indebted or singled out. The director's eyebrows lifted slightly, as though she hadn't expected the question, and she nodded, saying she could think of a few discrete options. Jonathan walked out into the crisp afternoon air with the conversation still echoing in his mind. The visit had been scheduled as little more than a formality, but it no longer felt that way. He could have told himself it wasn't his problem, that he was just a passing figure in the girl's life, yet the image of her sitting alone with her plain lunch refused to fade. There was a heaviness in him now, a pull toward action he couldn't quite explain. He had been trained to identify needs in business and fill them efficiently. Perhaps the same skill could apply here. That night, in the quiet of his apartment, he found himself opening his laptop and researching programs for school meal support. He thought about direct donations, about scholarships, about ways to make sure no child in that kindergarten would ever have to eat bread and water for lunch again. But it wasn't just about the meals, it was about the dignity that came from knowing you were seen, that someone cared enough to change your circumstances without demanding anything in return. He realized, with a certainty that startled him, that he was already past the point of simply walking away. Emma Harper, a 5-year-old stranger he had met only hours before, had somehow become the center of a decision that might alter both their lives. Jonathan's decision to help Emma and her mother began quietly, almost invisibly, as though he were slipping threads into the fabric of their lives without drawing attention to the weave. The morning after his visit to the kindergarten, he called his personal assistant and instructed her to prepare a transfer to the school support fund. It wasn't a token amount meant for a photo opportunity, it was enough to guarantee that every child enrolled would have access to free breakfasts and lunches for the next 3 years. He emphasized that the donation should be anonymous and that no public acknowledgement was to be made. For him, the point wasn't recognition, it was to ensure that no child, and especially no small girl with braids and blue eyes, would have to face a lunch of bread and water again. But that was only the beginning. Jonathan knew that food security at school was one thing, stability at home was another. Through discreet channels, he learned more about Susan Harper's situation. Her night job cleaning offices paid poorly, and her grocery store shifts were unpredictable. There were months when she worked 70 hours and still barely covered her bills. Jonathan could have written a check to cover her expenses, but he understood the danger of one-time relief. It didn't solve the root of the problem. Instead, he began working with the HR department at his company to create a new position, one that would fit her skills, offer consistent hours, and come with benefits. When the job posting appeared, it was sent directly to her through a recruiter who described it as a community partnership initiative. She had no idea that the man who had shared lunch with her daughter was the same man opening this door for her. While those plans moved forward, Jonathan found himself thinking about Emma more often than he expected. He arranged his schedule so that he could occasionally drop by the kindergarten under the guise of checking on the foundation's projects. On those visits, he would spot her in the playground or in the reading corner, usually with a book in her lap, her expression absorbed. He never lingered long enough to make it obvious, but each time he saw her, he felt that same pull he had experienced in the cafeteria, an instinctive need to make sure she was safe, that her small world was growing rather than shrinking. One afternoon, about 2 weeks after their first meeting, Jonathan returned to the school with a delivery. It wasn't a lavish gift, just a collection of art supplies, colored pencils, sketch pads, watercolor sets, labeled for the entire class. He remembered her telling him she liked to draw flowers, and while the gift was for everyone, he knew she would find herself among the colors and paper. From the window of his car as he left, he caught a glimpse of her holding a fresh sketch pad, her fingers tracing the cover like it was something rare and delicate. Even as he moved forward with these acts, Jonathan wrestled with an unfamiliar caution. In business, his moves were bold and direct, designed to be noticed, but here he wanted the opposite. He knew how pride could harden into resistance, especially for someone like Susan, who was carrying the weight of raising a child alone. He also knew that children sensed the difference between charity offered out of pity and help offered out of respect. Every decision he made had to come from the latter. By the end of the month, Susan had been interviewed for the position he had created and offered the job. She accepted with relief, seeing it as a long overdue piece of good fortune. With steady hours and a fair salary, she was able to leave her night cleaning job, and for the first time in years, she was home to read to Emma before bed. Jonathan learned of this from the school director, who mentioned how much happier Emma seemed in recent weeks. He didn't take credit. Instead, he filed the information away like a quiet victory, the kind that didn't require applause. Still, Jonathan was aware that money and resources could only do so much. What he had seen in that cafeteria was more than hunger, it was isolation. That was harder to mend, and it wasn't something he could fix from the shadows forever. He didn't yet know how or when, but a part of him was already planning for the moment when Emma would understand that the man who had sat beside her with a tray of pasta wasn't just a stranger passing through her life. He was someone who had decided, in that single moment, to step into it and stay. It was a Saturday afternoon when Jonathan visited Susan's apartment for the first time. The visit wasn't planned as a grand gesture. He had stopped by to drop off some paperwork for her new job that required a signature, and she had invited him in for coffee. The building was old but clean, the kind of place where tenants looked after what little they had. Inside, the space was small but orderly, with a single living room that doubled as a dining area and a narrow hallway leading to the bedroom Emma and her mother shared. The scent of fresh laundry hung in the air, and on the wall above a small bookshelf were several framed photographs, moments of a life Jonathan knew nothing about. As Susan poured coffee, he let his eyes wander, drawn to a particular picture in a simple wooden frame. It showed a younger Susan, smiling broadly, her arm around another woman whose face jolted him with recognition. He stepped closer, studying the features he hadn't seen in years. The dark hair, the familiar eyes, it was his half-sister, Laura. They shared the same father, a man who had been distant in both of their lives, and though Jonathan had seen her at family gatherings in his youth, they had lost touch long ago. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. He turned towards Susan, his voice quieter than before, and asked about the woman in the photograph. Susan's face shifted, her expression caught between hesitation and resignation. She explained that Laura was her best friend for many years and, more importantly, Emma's aunt. Jonathan's mind reeled as he pieced the connection together. Laura was his sister, which made Susan her close friend, and if Laura was Emma's aunt, that meant Emma was his niece. The math was simple, but the emotional impact was anything but. Susan sat down opposite him, her hands wrapped around her mug, and told the rest of the story. Years earlier, Laura had introduced her to Jonathan's father's side of the family, though the connections were complicated and strained. When Laura passed away unexpectedly, Susan found herself alone with Emma, choosing not to reach out to Jonathan or anyone else in that part of the family. She hadn't wanted charity, and she carried a deep mistrust toward people she believed had turned their backs on Laura when she needed them. In her eyes, keeping her distance was a form of protection. Jonathan listened, the weight of her words pressing against his chest. He couldn't deny that her perception of the family was accurate. His father had been emotionally absent, and the extended relatives rarely involved themselves in anything that didn't serve their own interests. But the idea that his own flesh and blood had been growing up just a few miles away without his knowledge struck him in a way he couldn't easily articulate. He thought back to the day in the cafeteria, to the inexplicable pull he had felt toward Emma, and now understood that some part of him might have recognized her even then, in ways beyond reason. Susan admitted she had noticed something change in Emma after that day, that the girl seemed lighter, more confident. She thanked him for his kindness, though she didn't yet know the full extent of what he had done. Jonathan didn't correct her or list the ways he had helped. Instead, he told her simply that Emma deserved to be seen, that no child should have to carry the weight of being made to feel small. When he left the apartment, the air outside felt colder than when he had arrived. The streets were the same, the city moved at its usual pace, but everything in his own world felt altered. The discovery had shifted his perspective entirely. Emma wasn't just a child he had decided to help out of compassion, she was family. The realization filled him with a strange mixture of urgency and patience. He wanted to tell her, to claim the bond between them, but he also knew it couldn't be rushed. Trust had to be built, not announced. Walking back to his car, he understood with absolute clarity that his involvement in her life was no longer a choice or a temporary act of goodwill. It was a responsibility, one written into his own history without his knowledge, and now that he had found her, there was no turning away. A full year had passed since that first day in the kindergarten cafeteria, and the changes in Emma's life were visible to anyone who cared to look. She no longer sat in the far corner during lunch, curling into herself as though she were invisible. Instead, she had a regular seat at a long table with friends, her laughter carrying easily over the hum of the room. Her lunches were no longer bread and water but varied and colorful, packed neatly in a way that showed someone had taken the time to think about what she liked. Susan's new job had brought stability into their home, and with it, a sense of calm that neither mother nor daughter had known for years. Evenings were now spent together over homework, bedtime stories, and conversations that didn't have to compete with the exhaustion of double shifts. Jonathan had remained a steady presence, though never in a way that overshadowed her life. He visited often enough for Emma to grow accustomed to him, to expect him, but not so often that it felt unnatural or forced. Over time, she had stopped glancing at him with the cautious uncertainty of their first meeting and started greeting him with the open warmth of someone who knew she was safe in his company. There were small milestones, her excitement when she showed him her first watercolor painting, her quiet pride the day she learned to read a full book on her own, the way she began to tell him stories about her dreams for the future as if he were someone who might help make them real. The question of when and how to tell her the truth about their connection had been a constant weight on Jonathan's mind. He knew there would be no perfect moment, no scenario in which such a revelation would be simple, but he also knew that trust was something she had to feel before she could fully understand. One evening in early autumn, with the air carrying the faint scent of fallen leaves, he found himself walking with her through the park near her home. She was holding his hand loosely, talking about the animals she'd seen at school that day, when he realized he couldn't keep the truth to himself any longer. He told her about Laura, about his sister, her aunt, and about how he had only recently learned who she was. He spoke gently, giving her space to ask questions. At first she was quiet, processing his words, and then she asked if that meant they were family. When he said yes, she studied his face for a long moment before nodding as if something she'd been unsure of had just fallen into place. She didn't say much after that, but when they reached her building, she leaned into him for a hug that lingered longer than usual. Months later, they found themselves in the same kindergarten cafeteria where everything had started. The room looked the same, the tables still small, the light still streaming in from the same high windows, but for Jonathan, it felt like stepping into another lifetime. Emma was no longer the solitary figure in the corner, she was at the center of a table, animated and engaged, her friends leaning in to listen as she spoke. When she saw him enter, she excused herself and came over, a sandwich in her hand. Without a word, she sat down next to him and broke it in half, offering the larger piece to him. "Now it's my turn to share," she said with a smile that carried both mischief and affection. The simplicity of the gesture caught him off guard, flooding him with the memory of that first day, the piece of bread, and the way she had tried to make herself invisible. Now she was here, meeting his gaze without hesitation, completely unafraid to take up space in the world. He realized then that his role in her life had never been about rescue, it had been about creating the space for her to grow into herself, to feel worthy of being seen. As they left the cafeteria together, her small hand slipped naturally into his. The path outside was lined with the first signs of spring, buds pushing through the branches, and the light felt softer somehow. Jonathan understood that his life had shifted irrevocably the moment he sat down beside her a year ago. It had started with an instinct to offer company, but it had become a bond that would outlast anything either of them could have imagined. In the quiet between them, there was no need for promises. The act of walking forward together was enough. For me, the ending of this story is powerful because it shows that true change often starts with the smallest of gestures, a seat at the table, a shared meal, a hand held without letting go. Jonathan's journey isn't framed as a heroic rescue but as a slow, deliberate choice to stay, to build trust, and to create a life where Emma could thrive without feeling like a charity case. The reveal of their family connection adds emotional weight, but what truly matters is that his commitment to her began before he knew the truth. By the time they walk out of that cafeteria together in the final scene, it's clear that their bond has grown beyond circumstance, it's become chosen family, forged from kindness, patience, and the courage to see someone fully and refuse to look away.